Welcome, Micheline. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us. You've always been very close to Inclusive Solutions from the very beginning of when we got started, and we particularly got a close attachment to you through publishing your wonderful books. The first one being Incurably Human, and the next one being Dear Parents, um, both of which you can get on our website. And obviously, and perhaps we'll talk to you about those in a little while. But maybe I thought maybe first off you could just start off by perhaps telling us a bit about yourself, really, about your background, what drew you to the world of inclusion.
I was born in 1950, which is a long time ago now. I was born in the days when disabled people were hidden away. I had a very strange childhood where I was really kept at home and given home tuition until I was 14. So I didn't go to school, while my sister did. And I was pretty cross about it. From pretty young in my age, I always thought that they were doing this to protect themselves, and it was nothing to do with protecting me. We're going to break whatever I did. I wanted to go to art college all the time I was growing up, for which you need 2 A-levels and a portfolio of work, which I knew I was never going to get at home. So once the opportunity came up to go to this very strange boarding school for disabled girls, I took it because I wanted the A-levels. It was my passport to art college. And there I met a lot of very wonderful young women who had all been segregated against their will, I would say. Quite a lot had been thrown out of mainstream school when they were 13, 14, 15. They were getting in the way of the exam statistics. By then, I'd already realised that I was always going to be at a disadvantage from this weird beginning. And not only me, but the world I was entering was totally uneducated, as it were, about people who were different, people who had needs that were not normally met. So art college, I did get to art college, but it really the teacher of a whole generation of young people I was learning with who had never met anyone like me, and I'd never met anyone like them. It was like coming from another planet. Yeah, so that's my early beginnings. What else can I tell you?
Well, how did you sort of go on to become such a massive champion for inclusive education? How did that all come about?
Well, I didn't start off that way.
No.
I started being a bit disillusioned with the world of commercial art and thinking I need to do something more relevant to the sort of struggle that I had found myself in, trying to enter the world as a disabled young woman. We're going back in time now. There was no disability movement. There was no conception that disability was an oppression like racism or sexism that you could organise and fight against. In those days, it was just seen as a cruel act of God, and if the doctors couldn't cure you, you were going to have a miserable life, That's how people thought it was sad. A sad act of fate, fate.
Yeah.
And I'd already begun to question that because in my early 20s, the women's movement was burgeoning and I became quite involved in it. And I quickly realized there were the same issues it was all about people's perception, prejudice, false limitations, stereotypes and all those things. And I became interested and involved in all here in the UK. That was my first thing. Young people who thought in the way that I did, that the non-disabled world needed better information about impairments and disability, and that the best people to give it to them was us. In fact, we were the only people that could really give it to them. So we set up a disability equality training, and took the platform, as it were, took the stage, and reversed in a way, reversed the power. And that, again, it was, in the time it was quite popular. We got paid to go and train all kinds of people. I live in London, and so the GLC, which at that time was led by Ken Livingstone, who was very progressive in very many ways, set up the Disability Resource Unit in County Hall and helped train lots of disabled people to do the training. And that was really my interest, and in campaigning for anti-discrimination legislation. It was only when I became a mother of a disabled child that I thought, oh, blow. I'm going to have to look backwards and revisit this education system that, in a way, I knew nothing about, except how wrong it was. Because to me, being an ally to a disabled child meant being with her, fighting these fights, So it was only then, I was in my early 30s then, that I thought all this work that we've been doing in personnel and in all sorts of services needed to be done within the education system too. And that's when I changed direction and became single-minded, if you like. I think I'd realized if we don't get it right when we're children, you almost can never get it right, because you've already set, whilst people are developing their sense of the world, who they are, you can do a lot to heal that as adults, but not completely. I don't think you ever can. So it seemed a really key issue to start getting right, so the harm never gets done in the first place. Sure. If you don't separate the children, that particular harm would never be done. There'd still be difficulties. I'm not no way pretending, but yeah. So that's how I changed direction at that point. Yeah.
And then eventually you became the director of the Alliance for Inclusive Education, of course. And how did that all come about?
Well, when I started off on this route, my daughter was 4 and looking to go to school, obviously. And I'd never been in a mainstream school in my life. So I was at a bit of a disadvantage. And I happened, again, by fortune, to meet some wonderful parents who had set up a group called Parents in Partnership at that time, who were campaigning I think it was the 1981 Education Act was coming into force, which for the first time could put resources into mainstream schools to support children with impairments, including learning difficulties, if the parents chose that.
Mm.
And these parents chose it. That was they understood it in the way I did. That, you know, how could the world ever learn if you teach them at day one that those kids don't belong with, you know, with you.
Yeah, yeah.
So they became, we started working together, really. They gave me this sort of passion that only parents can have about these things. And I gave them the whole perspective of the disability movement, which they didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a gut instinct, you know, for them.
Yeah.
But as time went on and we organized, I realized, or we all realized, that when parents fight for inclusion, people can always counter the argument by saying there are just as many parents who want special school, you know, and will fight to their end for that.
Mm.
So it was kind of seen as a one kind of parent against another kind of parent. And to be honest, they thought a lot of the parents who wanted inclusion were in denial about how dreadfully disabled their kids were and wanted them to be normal, which wasn't the issue at all. But what none of them was doing was listening to disabled people.
Mm.
None of them. It was like the entire education system, including the special education system, was founded on the thinking of non-disabled people. Never occurred to them, it seemed, to ask what we wanted or how we'd experienced it or what our thinking was about any changes. And it wasn't seen as a liberation issue for disabled people. It was seen as something else, you know, in thousands of ways. Whereas we had always seen it as an issue of equality.
Mm.
We never asked to be segregated, a disabled community.
No.
There's no campaigns, you know, whatsoever.
So this was about liberation and equality in your mind and heart at the time.
Absolutely. It was a lot more than getting a better education and being able to pass the exam to get a better job. That, of course, is part of it for some people, but not everybody. And a lot of the parents, I would say by far the majority of parents who were in that early campaign had children with Down syndrome.
Uh-huh.
And some of them had quite severe learning difficulties. And the goal was not to get to university and get a good job.
No.
The goal was a much more profound thing about what sort of society do we want to create.
Sure.
You know, how do we build community that can encompass diversity? And what can we learn from people who have a different experience and so on? It was a much, much more profound thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm getting lost. To remind me what I'm talking
yes, I was just asking about how, and then eventually the alliance was formed, and you became the director.
The alliance, we just created it because I met Richard Riesler. That was another fortuitous thing.
Oh yes.
Ilya was murdered, you know, by Margaret Thatcher, but in its last days, it had some money and it wanted to leave a bit of a written guidance for all these new separate local authorities that were being created all around London. And they commissioned a book, and Richard and I got thrown together to write it because
Here it comes.
Richard was a disabled teacher who didn't believe in inclusion.
Really?
He took the union line. He was a very strong trade unionist, and he knew he'd been discriminated against as a geography teacher who couldn't drive the van, you know. but he believed teachers had the right to exclude when we met each other. And then he spent 2 weeks sitting on my sofa, and we just talked and talked and talked. And he changed his mind, you know.
Oh, yes.
I think it was, you know, he had gone through mainstream education as a disabled young person and had never met disabled people. So he hadn't really got that perspective. So it was not what the powers that be were hoping for. They thought he was going to moderate my, you know, unrealistic, idealistic nonsense, you know, and bring the teacher's point of view to it all. But that isn't what happened. We didn't write, we compiled a book called Disability Equality in the Classroom. And it was the writings of many disabled people, you know. We tried to get a whole lot of diverse, both issues and voices in it. And Ilya published that book and sent it to every school in London. And it was the first book ever, really, that had put disability in that framework as a rights issue. Because of that, we then realised that we needed to organise. Disabled people needed some sort of organised voice to carry on fighting for all the things we'd spelt out in the book. And that's why the Alliance got created. It was a campaigning organisation, whereas Parents for which became Parents for Inclusion when they got it, was primarily a support organisation for parents and young people. But between us, we did the whole thing because we took on the campaigning wing. They took on the support wing, and between us, we trained. We made a decision that we would always do joint training. So there would always be a parent working with a disability equality activist as a training setup. And we wrote the courses, Planning Positive Futures, and various training courses that we wrote, coming from this joint perspective. It was very powerful.
Very much so, very powerful.
It really made a huge difference. Yeah.
Now, you know, Micheline, you know, back in the sort of the late 80s, the early 1990s, I mean, Derek Wilson and I, well, the early 1990s, we set up the Inclusive Solutions. We were being strongly influenced by what was going on in North America and Canada, Jack Pierpoint, Marsha Forrest, and those kind of people. Did you have much contact with those people?
And we did, because one of the allies, the organisations which supported us from the very beginning, was CSIE, the Centre for Studies for Inclusive Education, which was 2 people, of course, usual thing. And it was them that introduced us. They invited George Flynn,
George Flynn,
who was the director of the Waterloo School Board at that time, to come and do a talk. And he thought we might like it, you know, we might be interested. And it's one of those, you know, never to be forgotten meetings. He was amazing. And I don't think I'd ever seen, certainly, he was the equivalent of a director of education, more than just a head teacher. He was, you know, the whole school board, talking about how his community couldn't be complete if some children couldn't be there. And he done this amazing thing. He went and found all the children in his school board that were in segregated schools, and went and talked to their parents and asked them what would they need if we were to bring your children home, what would they need, and help them set it up. I just kind of was blown away by it, the vision, and the commitment. And they use this language of inclusion, which we didn't. At that time, we were talking about integrated education, which we knew was slightly problematic, but it was the best that we could think of at that time. The concept of inclusion seemed to me to encompass something bigger, a bit more, a bit deeper even. Yeah. And we changed our name. We kind of, that was, it was a big selling point. It was a big, no, I don't want to say selling point. It was a big turning point, I think, in winning over allies.
Sure.
Because when you talk about inclusion, meaning inclusion of everybody, all the other issues, behavior, race, whatever it was, they were all covered by this notion that the more diverse the community is, the stronger it is.
Yeah, fabulous.
And the more, that you build community by answering each other's different needs, that you need that.
Fantastic.
And that we were suffering from the lack of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know.
So let's rolling the clock on now, Micheline, right up to 2020. Yeah. Now, people will be watching this, and one of the big questions, and people watching this could be psychologists, special needs coordinators, teachers, parents, of course. The big question is always, well, why is inclusion in mainstream such a good idea? Why is it so important? And what would you answer them to this day?
To this day, the answer to me is extremely simple. That children need to make friends with each other. If you don't have the opportunity to make friends, you're never going to know the reality of that person's life or give a shit about them, to be honest. It's like it's a natural way of developing our humanity.
Sure.
So it isn't about, which is why inclusion to me is the real deal. It's not a mainstream school with a unit on the other side of the playground where the children never meet. Inclusion. It's not about getting all the expertise in one place. It's not about, getting A stars and all that, although some people will get the opportunity to do that. It's about the opportunity to play and befriend a child who, because of our history of segregation, people have been prevented from doing that. And to me, it's an equal right. Both sides have a right to this. It isn't only the disabled child. It's the whole community. So that's one thing. Of course, I also have the experience of my daughter going to a mainstream, who has virtually the same level of needs as I did as a child, and has had a completely different experience of growing up. And I can tell there were things have happened that I didn't foresee, in that, and they almost happened after she left school, because in the course of being at school, particularly secondary school, she made all kinds of friends, most of whom were not disabled. And because of that, she's been all over the world with them. She's been, she traveled around the USA on a Greyhound bus with one of her mates. She's been up mountains in India on somebody's back. She's, you know, she's just, the combination has opened up the world to her. And she has been able to influence, you know, thousands of people just by being her. And I mean, she's pretty amazing too, of course.
Pretty amazing, yeah.
But I hadn't foreseen that that would happen.
No.
You know, it was much more to do with wanting her to grow up feeling she belonged in the world, that this was her rightful place to be, and that if things weren't right for her, she could expect them to change, and she could, you know, help organize to change them in a way which is terribly important, but in a way it was just, it was smaller than what has actually happened, which is beyond my dreams, really.
Fantastic.
I've never seen disabled children who've been to special school with a level of confidence in the mainstream world that the children who have been included, even badly included, to be honest.
Well,
it's the long-lasting effects
yeah.
that is so important.
Well, that was interesting. Of course, that was going to be my next question. People again watching this will be saying, "Well, what's wrong with placing a child in a special school? What's the problem with special education?" And what would you answer them?
Where do I begin?
Where's a small question?
Well, I have to say, it's not the people working in them.
It's never the people.
I really want to say that because I do understand that we need expertise. It's not about not needing expertise. We do need it. And it's not about that those people want to do something wicked to us. It's not that at all. But it's because you're teaching both the disabled children and the non-disabled children that they don't need each other, that the world can exist perfectly well if you get all these lovely professionals, highly trained, highly paid people to create an alternative world for you to live in, while the main world carries on without you, without even noticing you're not there. And it's hard to explain the harm that does. If you think about any other group of people, you know, why did we fight against apartheid in South Africa? You know, why did we know that wasn't right? Look at the problems in Northern Ireland where they've separated the Catholics and the Protestants, you know, and not allowed them to know each other, to become friends. Prejudices can be stirred up and built. The lack of information, the vacuum it leaves can be filled, will be filled by all kinds of nonsense, you know. It's a divide and rule world, isn't it? You know, the more you divide people up, exactly, the less we could be united.
So for you, that's right at the heart of all of this, the division, the separating out, the segregating away. That's right, that lays at the heart of the problem of having a special education system.
Yes, to me it is. And it's the, well, also, to be honest, the special education system is not as special as people think it is. No. You know, the picture people have of what goes on in these schools, they think of them as hospitals, really, you know, where you've got kind of teachers stroke therapists that are going to make these kids better. Now, and I'm not saying there aren't some brilliant people that can do that, but they could do it equally well in mainstream, and they do, in fact, you know, probably with greater influence. It isn't the lack of expertise. I want to really, you know, I think the world should have more. I think there should be more experts, if you like, people with not private,
Sure.
knowledge and understanding of particular impairments or whatever. But they should be a resource to the whole community, not a way of separating them and us. Because, as you know, I don't need to tell you this, disabled people are not the type of person. We're not a breed apart. Disability happens to ordinary people. And it can be, and often will be, part of everybody's experience. You may have a disabled child, you may become disabled yourself, your relatives, and almost definitely your parents will become, at one time or another. We need to learn how to live with this. We need to learn how to make communities where this is seen as part of normal life, and we know how to deal with it and support people and not make it worse by all our, crazy ideas and lack of resources, lack of access, and all the rest of it.
It sounds a bit.
For me, it's about that.
And it sounds like you're touching on the medical model a bit there as well, that people are haunted by this notion that if you go to somewhere special, obviously it's special stroke treatment, they're going to get fixed, they're going to get treated, they're going to get cured because they're at the special place.
Yeah.
You think people get sold that by the system, by them from early doors?
Well, they get sold it, and it's all, I won't say it's exactly natural, but I can understand that if you think your child's ill, you want them to get better, if you've got that mindset. But it's also about the other thing, to be fair, is that many mainstreams are not inclusive.
True.
And parents have started out thinking they want them in mainstream, and they've just been appalled at the way their child's been treated,
Absolutely.
So it's an odd thing. It's a circular argument. Because inclusion isn't there, we need segregation. And it just goes round and round and round and round in circles.
And it gets a bit either or, doesn't it? Either or, which is...
Yeah. And one is never, when you're in, I'm absolutely sure if I was a teacher in mainstream, I would always, and I knew special schools existed, I'd always feel, I'll do my best, but if I can't do it, make it work. There's always somewhere better that really knows how to do it, And it's like, who's going to really, it's not the same at all, is it? As being, knowing you've got to make it work and putting the resources in there.
Sure. That's interesting. So you'd always be
see a barrier and maybe questioning what they're being asked to do in terms of competitive, exam results and all the rest of it. Maybe that's not helping any of the children, really. It might lead to a lot of very serious questions being asked.
And that wouldn't be a bad thing, would it? No. What about this? And what about this? What would you, advocates of inclusion right now, whoever they might be they parents or professionals, what would your advice be to them? Current advocates of inclusion. What should we be doing, if you like? What should people be doing?
My advice would be, let me have a think here.
Just a small question.
Yeah. Start off thinking about what kind of world do you want? Because right now we're living in a world that's about to destroy itself. It could do. The values that we've been taught to follow are now being shown to be extremely destructive. And school, or how you bring your children up, the community you bring your child up in, will be the community of the future. And they're going to want a world that survives and where we can survive, and which is perhaps based on much more cooperative and sustainable ways of being and thinking. And inclusion is essential for that. It's absolutely essential. In my now dotage, I think we have to think about all life in that way. You know, not only human life, but it's like, it's interesting, the connection with nature that has suddenly come alive in people through COVID and the climate fears and all the rest of it. That we are beginning to think differently about what makes life worth living, you know, what it's about. And so I would say there's nothing different than what I would advocate now to ever, which is about friendship, community, belonging. That nothing's changed. It's just it's got more urgent because the lack of it is showing itself in a huge, you know, global kind of way. The inequality between people, you know, what is it? Six men have as much wealth as half the world's population, poorest population. How can we let that carry on? How could that be a good thing? You know, and competition, greed, all those things, they've all led to it. And they also was what started segregation. That was why it happened in the first place. So I would say get educated about the past, where all these things came from. Remember that friendship is fundamental. Now and ever. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of now good practice. There's loads of young people like my daughter who lived it, who could talk to you about it.
So listen to them.
Yeah, massive. So, you know, I don't know what else to say. I think schools are becoming harsher and harsher places for all children.
So well, thank you so much for your wisdom and your passion around inclusion, Micheline, and for all you've done, all your contribution over all these years. A massive thank you from myself and so many other people. You know, so big appreciation, and thank you for this today. Just before we let you escape from this lovely conversation, your books. I wonder if you wouldn't mind. I think people might just be interested a little bit about, you know, what this book was all about, what drew you to it, you know, what was the heart of the book. What would you say about Incurably Human, which is, lots of people have read this and loved it.
Yeah, I mean, God, I wrote that quite a long time ago now. I'm trying to remember, but if I remember rightly, it was drawing together these three strands of disabled people and parents and allies, this notion of allies.
Yes.
Remembering, trying to give people courage, I suppose, confidence to go for it. Yeah.
It is a fantastic book. You know, headings like exclusion harms everyone. Absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Social model of disability, of course, you're writing about in here. Big time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lots of great stuff in there.
I suppose what makes it different, it was written from somebody who experienced it.
Exactly.
I think that's what makes it different to a lot of academic books you might read on the subject.
Because you lived it, exactly.
Yeah, it's not like that.
And then you went on to write this lovely book, Dear Parents, aimed at parents.
What brought me to write that was this idea that if disabled adults could answer the questions, what did your parents do well when you were a child? What are you proud of that they're pleased with that they did and was useful? And also, what do you wish they'd known when you were growing up? You know, so and it's an accumulation of all that wisdom. Again, it's more than just me writing. There's lots of disabled young adults and people who contributed to that, reflecting on how they would support and advise new parents new to this struggle, really.
Fantastic. A Gift to the World, yet another fantastic book. Marvelous. And I know you keep writing and keep thinking and keep speaking. And you were recently on the television, weren't you? Very recently.
I was, yeah. We did a great program, actually. I was very pleased with it. That again was initiated by young disabled television presenter who was absolutely shocked at how the reaction to her impairment. And she went on this exploratory journey. And it was called what was it called? Hidden Histories. Yes, or something like that.
Stories, I think, yeah.
Silence. It was called Silence.
Silence, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Just making up a whole new title here.
Yeah. It was called, and it was about, for the first time, it was actually about the oppression disabled people face. It wasn't trying to put a balanced viewpoint over it all. It was truly from our side. And luckily, both myself and my daughter were interviewed for it.
You were, you spoke amazingly. In fact, at the end, you managed to capture the kind of, you put a little twist of hope in, didn't you? In from the nightmare of what gone on in the past, you brought a little kind of hope for what, as the dusk kind of went down and the dawn began. That was beautiful words, beautiful, very haunting.
Thank you very much. And that can still on BBC iPlayer. So if anybody wants to watch it, they can still watch it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So a real big thanks, Micheline, for today. This has been really helpful. And yeah, stay in touch.
Yeah, and I want to say thank you, Colin, for keeping the flame burning.
We've got to keep that.
So many setbacks which we've had,
Absolutely. Let's keep
Has it been a harder struggle than you thought?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. And there's been some massive pushbacks, hasn't there? Massive pushbacks.
Yeah.
But we just got to keep our heads down, haven't we? Keep walking into the wind and the weather. Because but further up the road there, the sun is shining. The sun of inclusion. That's why I was thinking. Just keep going.
I like that, yeah.
We'll get there in the end, Micheline. But thank you for what you've done. You've changed history. You've changed history. So it's a privilege today. Thank you so much for that.
Thanks for being an ally.